The day Margaret Holloway handed Ray Kowalski the keys to her dead father's bakery, she was laughing. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind people use to soften bad news. It was the full-throated, head-thrown-back kind, the laugh of someone who believed, down to her bones, that she had just pulled off the deal of a lifetime. "Don't say I never gave you anything," she said, dropping the keys into his palm like they were bottle caps. Behind her, two of her associates from Holloway Capital stood near the black SUV, watching Ray the way people watch someone trip on a curb. That half-second of amusement before they look away. Ray looked down at the keys, then at the building. It had been a bakery once. Kowalski's Fine Breads, his father's name still faintly visible under years of grime on the transom window. His father had built it in 1987, and it had smelled like cardamom and burnt sugar for 30 years. Now, it smelled like nothing. The front window had been boarded up after a minor fire 2 winters ago. The awning had collapsed on one side and hung at an angle, striped canvas faded to gray. Half the signage had peeled away, what remained of the interior. The old deck ovens, the long proof racks, the marble countertop his father had hauled in from a demolition site in Hamilton, had sat idle for 4 years, collecting dust and damp. Margaret had bought the building off Ray's mother's estate 18 months earlier, when Ray was still working double shifts at the mill in Sault Ste. Marie and couldn't put together enough to make an offer in time. Margaret had plans for it, she'd said. A condo conversion, maybe a boutique hotel concept. She'd had architects come look at it. She'd had engineers. She'd had a developer from Toronto walk through with a clipboard. In the end, she decided the bones were wrong. Too much remediation. Too many surprises behind the walls. The numbers didn't work for what she wanted. So she sold it back to Ray Kowalski for $8,000 and laughed while she did it. "Seriously, Ray, you're going to need a bulldozer, not a loan." She paused, tilting her head with a particular pity of someone who has never needed to worry about money. "But good luck. Really." The SUV pulled away. Ray stood on the sidewalk in Selkirk, Manitoba on a Tuesday in late October, holding a set of keys to a building most people in town had already written off. His daughter Emma was 11. She was waiting for him at his sister Carol's place across town. He'd told Emma he was going to look at something, and she'd asked if it was good news or bad news, and he'd said he didn't know yet. Standing there in the cold, he still didn't know. But he went inside anyway. The smell hit him first. Old flour faintly underneath the mildew and char. 30 years of bread baked into the walls. He stood in the doorway for a long time, not moving. His father, Bernard Kowalski, had started the bakery with $1,200 and a second-hand Hobart mixer he'd driven to pick up in Thunder Bay. He'd worked 5 in the morning until 8 at night, 6 days a week, for the first 3 years. Ray remembered being 7 years old, sitting on an overturned crate near the back door, doing homework while his father shaped loaves with flour-dusted hands. He remembered the sound of the deck oven opening and closing. He remembered the weight of the bread bags, how heavy they were when you were small. Bernard had died of a stroke in 2019. Ray's mother had tried to keep the bakery going for 1 more year and couldn't manage it alone. Then COVID had come, and then the fire, and then the estate, and then Margaret Holloway. Now here was Ray, standing in the wreckage of something his father had built. He didn't cry. He wasn't that kind of man. But he stood there for a while, and he let himself feel it. Then he started looking. The deck ovens. 2 of them, Bongard double-decks French-made, 30 years old, were still there. One had fire damage on the exterior casing, but when Ray crouched down and looked at the stone deck inside, it was intact. These were ovens that cost $12,000–$15,000 to replace. The fire had touched the surface, not the machinery. The Hobart mixer was gone. Someone had sold it somewhere along the way. But the proof racks were still there. Old wire and steel things, bent but structurally sound. The marble counter, gray Carrara, 6 feet long, was cracked at one end but had survived. The walk-in cooler at the back was dead but intact. The structure of the building, despite what the architects had told Margaret, was solid masonry. The surprises behind the walls were mostly old electrical, not structural failure. Ray had worked construction for 8 years before the mill. He knew the difference between cosmetic damage and real damage. He walked every inch of that building for 2 hours, and when he came out the back door into the frozen alley, he sat down on an old wooden pallet and pulled out the small notepad he always kept in his jacket. He started writing down what he saw, not problems, possibilities. He called his sister that night after Emma was asleep. "You bought it," Carol said. It wasn't a question. "I bought it." A pause. "Ray, I know. You have savings for Emma's." "I know what I have, Carol." Another pause. "What's your plan?" He looked at the notepad on the kitchen table. "Make bread." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and meant it, and that was enough. The first month was the kind of hard that doesn't make good stories while it's happening. Ray slept at Carol's and drove to the bakery before 5 every morning. He spent the first 3 weeks on remediation, tearing out the damaged drywall, pulling the old wiring, cleaning the stone decks with equipment he borrowed from a restoration company in Portage la Prairie. He did most of it alone, and he did it around a part-time job at a hardware supply warehouse that paid enough to keep the lights on. Emma came on weekends. She was 11 and serious about things, the kind of kid who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She swept floors and passed tools and developed a strong opinion about the correct way to stack reclaimed lumber. She didn't complain. Ray hadn't asked her not to complain. She simply wasn't built that way. She had her grandfather's patience, the kind that came from watching something difficult and deciding to wait it out. "Is the oven going to work?" she asked one Saturday, looking at the Bonguard. "I think so." "When will you know for sure?" "When I turn it on." She considered this. "Okay." He found a retired electrician in Selkirk named Don Wiebe who agreed to do the rewiring at cost in exchange for a standing order of rye bread once the bakery opened. Ray fixed the awning himself with materials from the warehouse. He repainted the transom window himself. He was not a natural painter, and it showed a little, but the name was legible. Kowalski's Fine Breads, same as it always was. He turned on the first oven on a Wednesday morning in late November, alone at 5:15 a.m. He stood back from it the way you stand back from something you're not sure about. The heating elements cycled. The stone deck began to warm. The temperature gauge climbed steadily. Ray put his hand near the vent and felt the heat. He sat down on the floor of his father's bakery and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then he got up and started mixing dough. Word travels in small cities in ways that have nothing to do with advertising. The first week, Ray sold bread out of the front window. He didn't even have the display case back in yet. To people who had heard, somehow, that Kowalski's was firing ovens again. Some of them were old enough to have bought bread from Bernard. One woman, Helga Anderson, came in on the third day, bought 2 loaves of the dark rye, pressed Ray's hand between both of hers and didn't say anything. She came back the following week. And the week after? By January, Ray had opened the full counter. He was doing loaves, then rolls, then the butter tarts his father had made every Friday, an old Ukrainian recipe adapted for a Manitoba winter, heavy with brown sugar and just enough salt to cut the sweetness. The butter tarts sold out every Friday by 10 in the morning. He hired one part-time assistant in February, a young man named Tyler Friesen, 22, who had worked at a chain grocery bakery and was bored to the point of despair. Tyler learned fast and asked good questions, and Ray found that having another person in the bakery changed the energy of the place in ways he hadn't expected. It felt less like an act of personal stubbornness and more like something real. Emma came in on Saturday morning school permitting. She had taken it upon herself to manage the social media pages, a job Ray had not asked her to take on and was privately grateful she had. She photographed the bread the way she photographed everything, with a kind of spare attention to detail that surprised people who met her. A photo she took of a fresh-from-the-oven sourdough boule, steam rising against the gray morning light from the back window, got shared several hundred times in a local community group in March. Orders picked up noticeably the following week. Ray noticed. He didn't say much about it, but he noticed. In April, 6 months after he'd unlocked the front door for the first time, a woman from a regional food publication drove up from Winnipeg to write a short piece on local bakeries making comebacks post-pandemic. She spent 2 hours at Kowalski's, talked to Ray, talked to Tyler, ate a piece of the dark rye with butter and made a sound that Ray chose not to mention in polite conversation afterward. The piece ran in May. It was 3 paragraphs, which was enough. A restaurant in Winnipeg called the following week. They wanted a standing weekly order: sourdough, rye, and the potato bread that Ray had recently added to the rotation using his mother's recipe. A cafe in Portage La Prairie called after that, then a catering company that did corporate events across the province. Ray sat with the numbers one evening in June, at the kitchen table where he'd always sat, with a cup of coffee and the same notepad from October. He went through revenue, expenses, orders, projections. He was not someone who got theatrical about good news. He sat with the numbers for a long time, working through them carefully, checking his math twice. Then he closed the notepad and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the street, which was quiet at that hour, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for a long time. Margaret Holloway came into Kowalski's on a Thursday in early July. Ray recognized her before she recognized him. She'd walked in behind a group of other customers and was looking at the display case with the distracted attention of someone killing time. She was wearing a blazer, her hair shorter than he remembered, a phone in one hand. She looked up. The moment lasted a second or two. In that second, Ray watched her register it. The full case, the customers at the counter, the hand-lettered chalkboard menu, the smell of fresh bread and coffee, Tyler moving efficiently behind the counter, the name on the transom window visible through the glass from inside. Kowalski's Fine Breads. Ray, she said. Margaret. He was already behind the counter. What can I get you? She looked around. You actually did it. We've been open since November. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her recalculating something. The professional habit of reassessment. She'd spent months and thousands of dollars on architects and engineers and developers, and arrived at the conclusion that this building wasn't worth the remediation cost. Ray had spent $8,000 and done most of the remediation himself. I heard about the Winnipeg restaurant contract, she said finally. He hadn't advertised it. She must have asked around or someone had mentioned it. Selkirk was still a small city. We've got 3 wholesale accounts now, Ray said. He said it the way he said most things, without particular emphasis, just information. Margaret nodded slowly. She looked at the display case again. I'll take a loaf of the rye, she said, and one of those butter tarts. He packed them up. She paid. She stood at the counter for a moment longer than necessary. The ovens still work, he said. I can see that. French maid, 30 years old, stone deck still perfect. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite respect. Something that sat in between. That didn't have a clean name. She had laughed on the sidewalk in October and handed him keys like they were a joke. He had taken the joke and made something out of it. Good for you, Ray, she said. It wasn't an apology. He hadn't expected one. He watched her walk out. Through the front window, he saw her pause briefly on the sidewalk, looking up at the sign. Then she continued toward the parking lot. Behind him, Tyler was sliding a new tray of rolls into the second oven. The warm air moved through the bakery. Someone at the counter was asking about the Saturday order. Ray turned back to work. By fall 1 year from when he'd stood outside in the October cold with a set of old keys, Kowalski's Fine Breads had 4 full-time employees, 6 wholesale accounts, and a waiting list for Saturday morning butter tarts that Carol described as embarrassingly long, with the specific pride of a sister who had said okay when it counted. A regional grocery chain approached Ray in September about a private label partnership, a line of Kowalski's bread sold in their Manitoba and Saskatchewan stores. He took 3 weeks to think about it, talked to an accountant, talked to Don Wiebe for some reason, and then said yes. They negotiated the terms over the course of October and signed in November, almost exactly 1 year to the day from when he'd first fired up the Bongard oven. He called Carol that night. You're going to be in grocery stores, she said. Just Manitoba and Saskatchewan to start. Ray. I know. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up when he got off the phone. Good news? She asked. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. Good news. She went back to her homework. He poured a glass of water and stood by the window for a while. He thought about his father, the way he often did, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of ongoing conversation that didn't require the other person to be there. Bernard had started with $1,200 and a second-hand mixer. He had built something that lasted 30 years and outlasted him, even through the fire and the vacancy and the years of dust and the architects with clipboards who decided the bones were wrong. The bones had been fine. They had always been fine. Ray had known that the moment he walked through the door in October. He hadn't needed an engineer to tell him. He'd needed to look. That was the thing people with money sometimes forgot, he thought. That looking was its own skill. Seeing past the surface damage to the thing underneath. His father had known how to look. Ray had learned it from him, standing in this same building as a boy, watching how Bernard's hands moved over the dough, knowing which loaves were ready by the sound they made when you knocked on the bottom. You had to know what you were looking at. Margaret Holloway had looked at the building and seen a liability. Ray had looked at it and seen his father's hands. He finished his water. He rinsed the glass. He went and sat at the table across from Emma and asked her about her homework, and she told him about the social studies project she was working on, something about the history of Manitoba agriculture, and he listened. And outside the window, Selkirk was quiet and cold and beginning to look like winter again. Everything in its right place. I keep thinking about the moment Ray stood in that doorway. The smell of old flowers still in the walls, the fire damage on the oven casing, the collapsed awning hanging sideways in the October cold. Most people would have walked back out. Most people would have walked back out. Most people would have called it a loss and moved on. He didn't, and I think that's worth sitting with for a minute. What Ray had wasn't luck. Margaret Holloway had access to architects, engineers, developers, consultants. She had more resources in one quarter than Ray had seen in a decade. She looked at that building and made a calculated, professional decision. She was wrong, not because she was careless, but because she was looking at the wrong things. She saw the surface, the collapsed awning, the fire damage, the remediation cost. Ray looked at the stone deck inside the oven and knew it was intact. He looked at the masonry walls and knew the structure was sound. He looked at his father's name on the transom window and understood something that no engineer's report could quantify. That's Mount Luck. That's what I'd call real intelligence. The kind that comes from paying attention over a long time to things that actually matter. Bernard Kowalski had spent 30 years teaching his son, without ever framing it as a lesson, how to look past what something appeared to be and see what it actually was. Ray inherited that. He used it. And then there's the question of what he did once he saw it. He had every reason to hesitate. Emma was 11. His savings were limited. The building needed months of work before it could earn $1. He took the risk anyway, not recklessly, but deliberately. He slept at his sister's place. He worked part-time at the warehouse. He borrowed equipment. He traded bread for electrical work. Every single decision was made with clear eyes and a steady hand. That's not stubbornness for its own sake. That's the kind of perseverance that actually builds things, the kind that knows the difference between pushing through difficulty and ignoring reality. And through all of it, he kept showing up as a father. Emma swept floors on weekends. She learned to stack lumber. She taught herself photography and built the bakery's online presence without being asked. Kids don't do that in environments where they feel like a burden. They do it when they've watched someone they love do hard things with dignity, and they want to be part of it. Ray gave her that without ever making a speech about it. I think about what would have happened if Ray had let the humiliation of that October morning define him. Margaret laughing, the associates smirking, the keys handed over like a punchline. He could have let that become the story. A lot of people do. Instead, he let it be a Tuesday and went to work on Wednesday. That's the part that stays with me. The moment where you decide whether the thing that happened to you is going to be your identity or just something that happened. Ray chose the second one. Quietly, without announcing it, without needing anyone to watch. 1 year later, his bread was on grocery shelves across 2 provinces. Helga Anderson was still coming in every week. Emma was still behind the counter on Saturday mornings. And the oven his grandfather had argued was beyond saving was still warm.